Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are continuing the series of ranking every episode within different seasons of MLP Friendship is Magic, and today we are covering Season 5, and I talked about this before, but I consider Season 5 one of my favorite seasons of the show. While it isn't the most consistent season throughout, as we'll get into once we get into the list, I feel like towards the top, it really has a very strong batch of episodes, and has plenty of interesting storylines and themes to go along with it. So obviously we'll be covering that. But as usual, there are 24 episodes to rank here, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the list. So starting off at number 24, the worst episode of season 5. And I'm not going to lie, this was a debate for me because I feel like there are two episodes that are really, really bad and should probably take up the spot. But one of them is arguably more broken than the other one, but is one that I wouldn't mind rewatching as much. The other one is also pretty broken, not to the same degree, but also one that is far less enjoyable to watch. So it was really a debate for me. And it's possible that this could change between now and when the full blown episode ranking comes out. But at number 24, I decided to go with the more broken episode. And here we have Princess Spike. And obviously, this is considered one of the worst episodes in the series, and I feel like a lot of the issues I have with it still stand. I mean, mainly the fact that the story doesn't work on any level. I mean, you have the whole friendship summit that Twilight put together, but obviously she's sleeping through a lot of it because she was so busy preparing for it that she didn't bother to think about what she's going to do during it. That's not ideal. You have the fact that they decided to have Twilight fall asleep in a room where there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of construction going on. There's a lot of events going on. Just a very noisy area. And you expect Spike to take all this responsibility on. That's not great either. You have all the people at the summit getting really petty and not being able to resolve any issues on their own. And they decide to go straight to Twilight Sparkle to try to fix it, only for Spike to have to step in. Like, they literally couldn't say that Twilight is unavailable right now, or that maybe she's busy doing other stuff. Like, they couldn't have come up with any better excuse. As a result, bringing all these people towards her quarters to try to get stuff done, that's not great either. You have the fact that a lot of the stuff that really goes wrong, that really causes the conflict to blow up in its face, comes from stuff that Spike did out of good faith. I mean, the episode has Spike getting kind of selfish towards the tail end of it, and you think that with this episode trying to teach Spike the lesson of not letting the power get to his head, that the stuff that would really go wrong would be stuff that he does while he's being selfish. When in reality, the stuff that really goes wrong, like him telling the construction worker to not work on the pipe, and telling the guy to not saw down a bunch of trees that he's allergic to, all that happens while he's at the beginning of the episode, when he is acting in good faith, that when he genuinely wants to do the good thing. And yet the episode wants us to believe that all this stuff, all the problems in the episode came from Spike getting selfish. And yes, while that does happen briefly, I mean, again, it doesn't really address the core issues of the episode. And of course, the ending itself isn't that great either, where it just decides to cut the black before he destroys the statue again. I don't really like that. And it feels like a lot of the issues in the episode are sort of brought into existence by Cadence, where obviously Cadence is like, Spike, I'm concerned the power is getting to your head. And then Spike immediately lets the power get to his head, where before that, it seemed like a lot of the episode was him just doing the right thing. And again, I get all the complaints with this episode. This is a broken episode. It does not work on any level. The message doesn't make a lot of sense. The story beats don't make a ton of sense. And just the connective tissue of how the story leads into the message doesn't make sense at all. So it's a mess of an episode, and it is one of the worst episodes in the entire series. Mind you, I feel like it is one that I would rather rewatch than the next episode we talk about on the list. But for now, considering that it is more fundamentally broken, I have it here at number 24. Now we're moving on to number 23. And again, this is another very terrible episode. And here we have Appaloosa's Most Wanted. And I mentioned this a moment ago, but I feel like this episode is more dreadful to rewatch than Princess Spike, which at the end of the day, Princess Spike is just kind of boring when you really watch it. whereas Appaloosa's Most Wanted can be a bit frustrating at times to watch, as we have to watch Trouble Shoes get into trouble over and over again, just screwing up over and over again, and people just blaming him for stuff, and him just having to deal with the fact that his life's purpose is to screw things up so badly that people laugh at him as a result. I mean, that's not very fun to watch. I mean, really, a lot of this episode is just like feeling bad for Trouble Shoes, like in the sense that he keeps screwing up, that he keeps getting outcast, and getting sad that he is just accepting this fate in his life. And the fact that the episode ends with him sort of not really resolving that, but instead just finding a positive spin on it is not ideal, in my personal opinion. I mean, yeah, like he is making people happy, but he's making people happy by failing and just bumbling around and like getting hurt, like he's humiliating himself. He's just like not having a good time. People are just feeding off that misery, except now that misery is turned into happiness because he knows that he's making other people happy. I mean, that's not really a good message to teach at the end of the day. And obviously, it's a big reason why this is one of the worst episodes from the season. And again, it's just not fun to watch at all. However, there is one redeeming quality to it. It is that it at least ties into the season's themes, obviously dealing a lot with cutie marks, and it does sort of tie into the CMC's journey of helping them discover that their purpose is to help others discover their purpose. So at least this episode ties into that theme. They do at least help Trouble Shoes find his purpose, even if that purpose is really, really bad. But everything else about this episode is just dreadful to watch. I mean, I never really want to watch this episode again unless I'm doing it for a video, but it is somewhat saved by its connection to the theme, and it is at least somewhat functional on a story basis, where I feel like Princess Spike doesn't work on any level. So it's because of those reasons I have this episode here at number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22, and we are finally talking about a new episode for this list. And I can see some people thinking this one's a bit too low, but I just feel like the more I think about it, this episode just doesn't work. But here at number 22, we have the one where Pinkie Pie knows. And this is a weird episode to talk about because I think there was a decent message that could have been had here with Pinkie. However, I don't think that's what they were going for. And even if it was, like, this is not the correct story for that message. So obviously my biggest gripe with this episode is that Pinkie is straight up out of character. If anyone on the show understands the value of keeping promises, particularly when it comes to sensitive information, it should be Pinkie. This is the same character that allowed the conflict of green isn't your color to last as long as it did, as I talked about in my season 1 video. Because Twilight promised, Pinkie promised, she wouldn't share the information that would resolve said conflict. I mean, heck, this episode references Pinkie promises multiple times, but yet it acts as if Pinkie Pie is Lenny Loud, incapable of holding secrets, and the last person you ever want to trust to keep a surprise. So here, Pinkie receiving the information that Cadance and Shining Armor are having a baby, and yet she never Pinkie promises to keep it a secret? You'd think that would add an extra layer of conflict, because she doesn't, and it's not even the inherent drive to keep her word that makes this task simple for her either. Like, she literally spends the entire episode on the verge of letting it fall out of her mouth. Now, I'm sure some people will say, well, people struggle to hold to their morals in real life. This show shows how things are easier said than done. And normally I would agree with those people. But this episode doesn't really attempt to explore why Pinkie is struggling to keep this a secret. I guess you could say because it's really big news. But then again, look at who we're talking about here. How does Pinkie reconcile her potentially failing to keep her implicit promise to Mrs. Cake, Shining Armor, and Cadance with the fact that she holds her own Pinkie promise system in such high regard? If she ends up spoiling the surprise, would that trigger some identity crisis? I'm not saying this episode had to go that deep, although deep down I would find that pretty cool, but it could have done a much better job at exploring the issues that arise in this scenario. Again, you could have had an episode where Pinkie learns to not hold it against anyone that breaks a Pinkie promise, as keeping promises can be easier said than done, but this wasn't the correct story for this. And despite the episode recognizing that pinky promises exist, they have no role in the central conflict, even though they should have been center stage. And also, I had to address the ending, which is so weird. Like, we had that gag of Pinkie falling to pieces. It was just very out of place, both like stylistically within the show, but also with its sense of humor. Like, it was just so jarring to see. And it doesn't get much better when we have Cadence congratulating Pinkie for keeping the secret as if that was something Pinkie wasn't expected to do. Again, reinforcing that the episode wasn't as invested in advancing Pinkie's character. Now, there are a couple of moments in this episode that are kind of funny, but I'm not gonna lie that even the humor in this episode just doesn't click well with the rest of the show. Like, I mean, a lot of it just feels like random humor, and a lot of it just isn't that funny. Now, admittedly, the best moment in the episode comes when her friends face her in the tower and she like almost spills the beans. Like, and we have that moment of her like getting stuck in her head as her friends turn into balloons, and we have that visual of them surrounding Pinkie while she struggles to keep it in. And I felt like that would have made the episode a lot more interesting if she actually spilled the beans there. But no, Cadence and Shining Armor just show up, and the rest of the episode just returns to the usual shenanigans. So I don't know. I feel like some people may think I'm being too hard in this episode, but I feel like it's just so contradictory to who Pinkie as a character. Like the fact that the character who's known for holding people accountable for promises is herself struggling to keep promises and struggling to keep in information that people are trusting her to keep secret. And the episode shows zero self awareness for this, instead, relying all on these really bizarre gags that don't really gel well with the rest of the series. So I feel like those are all pretty big knocks for me, and a big reason I have it here at number 22. Now moving on to number 21, and we have another episode that I already talked about in a previous video. Admittedly, this one isn't as broken as the ones we already talked about, but similar to Appaloosa's Most Wanted, it is an episode that I find frustrating at points. And here we have What About Discord? And again, I already talked about this one previously, and I remember talking about not liking it the first time I watched it. I mean, a lot of it comes off as Discord, again, deliberately stifling communication, which, if you've seen my previous videos, you know that's not something I enjoy watching very much. And obviously, we have Twilight getting jealous, and how this is all Discord's plan to teach her a lesson for some reason. I mean, and it's not too clear why. I mean, Twilight never really demonstrated herself as someone that needed to be included on everything. And it seems like this is something that was simply thrust upon her. And obviously, while she does get jealous, I mean, that's a very natural reaction, especially when someone like Discord is enforcing this lack of communication where, yeah, some of it is her friends deliberately thinking that's not like very natural to talk about something that's already happened, saying, oh, you should have been there. And obviously, Discord is just doubling down on that even more. So that's not particularly great. I mean, really, in general, the main six come off as very insensitive, where it's very apparent that Twilight is trying to just figure out what happened. But instead, they're just continuing to bring up these issues that are just making Twilight more and more upset. And obviously, when Twilight lashes out at the end, they are pretty understanding and quick to apologize, but it still doesn't make up for the majority of the episode being Twilight just feeling this way and just slowly like feeling like she is being let down. So that's not particularly great. Plus the ending is sort of jumbled where again we find out that Discord was the one to orchestrate all this, and then they literally just give him a taste of his own medicine by giving him a sense of FOMO as well. So again, at the end of the day, it's not an episode that I particularly enjoy even now. I mean, yes, the message is pretty relatable and that, you know, like FOMO is a real thing, but it's still a pretty frustrating watch for a lot of it, with Discord really being a major reason for that. And that's a big reason that I have this episode here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and we're wrapping up this grouping of episodes that are very flawed, more so than have pros. However, I actually enjoyed this one more than the others, and actually consider putting it above some other episodes we'll be talking about shortly, but the flaws keep it down here. And here we have Tanks for the Memories. And yes, I do have this episode pretty low on the list, but I don't hate it as much as other people. Now, obviously, I do share a lot of the common criticisms with the episode. I mean, the death analogy is pretty overblown as hibernation is only a couple months. And even then, I mean, while Rainbow Dash just emphasized how she doesn't want to be alone, I mean, she still has her friends. So there's that to consider. Rainbow Dash obviously goes too far in trying to stop Winter and doesn't get any recourse despite it being quite apparent to her friends that she was behind it all. And even the climax, while full of iconic lines that I'll quote forever, gets a bit off the rails once it turns into a little cry pile. Like, what was the point of reinforcing Fluttershy's character development of being more assertive if she was just going to break down from watching Rainbow Dash cry anyway, which, again, she caused? It seems like they were trying to make the moment funny, but still pretty jarring. But on the whole, the scene itself still has some pretty iconic lines, as I said, like Fluttershy saying, Rainbow Dash, your winter is going to be petless. And then obviously Pinkie telling Twilight that Applejack cries on the inside. That's another pretty memorable line there. So again, it is a pretty good scene, but it's still a very jarring scene that kind of is a bit confused tonally, but whatever. I mean, the flaws are pretty hard to ignore with this episode. However, I actually kind of like it anyway, despite those flaws. Now, I know people like Star Giant have already brought this up, but I think it bears repeating. I mean, what is the purpose of winter in Equestria? I mean, if ponies are able to control the weather, then why would you intentionally create weather that slows down production, makes things colder, dumping snow on the ground, and just makes life harder in general? And even beyond that, the origin story of your biggest holiday, Hearthwarming Eve, is centered around keeping the Wendigos at bay, which bring about winter. So obviously, that's another confusing thing. Now, the show does imply that ponies have winter for cultural reasons, more specifically that they enjoy ice skating, sledding, playing in snow, that type of stuff. And I kind of get it, but why can't you just designate certain regions to have snow all the time while leaving the rest of the country in perpetual summer? I mean, that way ponies that enjoy winter activities can access them year round, while everyone else can enjoy being outside. You probably guessed this by this point, but I obviously do not like winter at all. I feel like it's a very bad season. I mean, yes, it's kind of cool for the holidays, but it's like once January hits, I just want it to be done with. So I am coming at this from a bit of a biased perspective, but literally, like, you have a world where you can control the weather. Like, why not just end winter as we know it? I mean, the show never offers a valid reason why winter needs to happen. I mean, while that doesn't necessarily help this episode's story on an objective level, I can at least sympathize with Rainbow's efforts to stop winter on a personal level because, again, winter sucks. Also, while it leans a bit into Defying Gravity territory, the song is pretty good. I feel like Ashley Ball is the best singer among the voice actors in the main cast, and I feel like it's nice to see Rainbow get her own solo number, especially one that really allows Ashley to express her vocal range. I mean, considering Rainbow is the closest to our natural voice, I feel like it really highlights that as well. So I do at least enjoy the song. However, again, the issues are very apparent. I can't have the episode too high because of them, but there are several things that I do enjoy about this episode, which is a big reason I have it here at number 20. Now we're moving on to number 19, and we are kind of moving on to this grouping of episodes that I find kind of boring, if I'm being perfectly honest. And even with this episode, I mean, it's not a terrible episode, although it is pretty boring at the end of the day. And here we have the Hooffields and McColts, and this was all right for what it was. Now, admittedly, when it comes to these episodes that are meant to reflect political division and polarization in the real world, I tend to be pretty cynical about those, as I feel like there's just so many structural issues that prevent people from just getting along. Like, I feel like there's just so much going on that stuff like this just simply cannot cover. So I try not to let that weigh me down too much when watching these episodes. Although I feel like I always have to bring up certain issues. Like, I guess the main one being, yes, we do get a resolution with Fluttershy pointing out how the animals are being affected by the conflict, and that somehow encourages the two families to stop fighting. Whereas I feel like in the real world, it'd probably be like, well, wouldn't they just continue to blame each other? Wouldn't they just blame the others for making the animals' lives suffer while pretending like they're somehow acting in the animal's best interest, and then the conflict just continues? I don't know, like that's something that always sticks to my mind whenever it comes to these episodes. But again, I'm not going to weigh it down too much. I mean, they are just trying to tell a story about resolving conflict, how you can't always rely on sticking by the book. But at the end of the day, the reason this episode is this slow is because it's just boring. Like I don't really like rewatch this one very much. There isn't really a lot to really sink my teeth into. Like a lot of it's just these two sides fighting over and over again. It kind of gets repetitive after a while. Yes, while it is somewhat realistic, it's also something that I don't really care that much about. So because of that, I have it here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and we have a slightly more interesting episode, but even then, it's not that great. And here we have Rarity Investigates. Now, this episode ended up being alright for what it was. Now, I'll be fully honest, when I first heard about this premise way back when, before this episode came out, I didn't like the premise. Stories in which a character is wrongly accused of a crime don't really appeal to me because all I can imagine is the amount of suffering that can have on someone in real life. And I can't believe shows like The Loud House think it's a good idea to have not one, but multiple episodes with this very premise, but I digress. If you're familiar with the content on this channel, you can probably tell that I'm just a weird person with an even weirder taste in media. And as for the episode itself, I mean, it did turn out all right. I mean, considering the fact that I don't like the premise that much. I think what really helps it for me is the fact that it focuses a lot on Rainbow Dash. I mean, I feel like usually in stories like these, it's way too easy to just kick the victim accused of the crime off to the side to be punished or be sad, while dedicating all the attention to the investigators, finding the clues and clearing the other guy's name. And again, my weird brain just sees that as trivializing the suffering. But here we see Rainbow Dash follow Rarity along as she's investigating the crime, and as they find evidence that's seen to incriminate her, we see Rainbow Dash start doubting herself, thinking that maybe she did commit the crimes anyway, somehow, even if she wasn't aware of it. I mean, that itself is pretty interesting, and even if you know it sounds absurd, you can at least understand how Rainbow would react that way, given what she's seeing. Also, while I'm not a huge film noir fan, I like the way they approached it here. And honestly, it's kind of funny seeing Rarity change costumes and look like she's just messing around, despite actually collecting quite a bit of evidence. Now, with that said, it's not without its problems. One is that the actual crime committed is honestly kind of pathetic, even by the standards of these stories on kid shows. Like, Rainbow could be kicked out of the Wonderbolts because she wrote a fake letter saying that Spitfire's mommy was sick, causing her to race home and possibly miss the show. Also, that Rainbow could take her spot in the show and possibly move up the ranks. Like, I get there was deception involved, but that seems like quite the punishment for a seemingly minor offense. Not that I'm complaining too much, but if we're like talking objectively here, maybe you could have upped the ante a bit. Like maybe Wind Rider could have actually gotten Spitfire's mom sick and tried to pin it on Rainbow. At least then the other Wonderbolts could have been reasonably disgusted by how low someone would go just to be in a show and move up the ranks. And then there's Wind Rider, the very obvious bad guy who did all this because he wanted to hold on to his record. I mean, not the worst motivation in the world, but it's not great either. And yeah, I figured out pretty quickly he was behind it all, as the episode didn't do that great of a job at hiding it. But considering what this episode could have been, it wasn't that bad. I mean, it has some good ideas, which soften the blow as the premise I don't like, but it does have some technical issues. And at the end of the day, I feel like other episodes just top it. So for me, that sort of leaves me to put this here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we kind of have a similar episode. Not so much in me not liking the premise, but more so in its execution. But here, number 17, we do have Hearthbreakers. Now, admittedly, this is a pretty fun episode, as I alluded to. I know I already talked about this one in my holiday ranking, but even so, I feel like the main issue with this episode is its execution, where it doesn't have the worst message in the world. Like, it's trying to show how the two families can come together to create new traditions, how the fact that they stick so closely to their traditions despite welcoming new people into their lives is what drives a lot of the conflict here. However, I feel like the biggest problem with this episode is that it just focuses a bit too much on the apples adapting to the pies more so than the pies adapting to the apples. Which sort of makes sense because, I mean, the apples are the visitors. Like, they are coming onto the Pie's territory here. But even so, like with the message being that these two families are trying to compromise a bit, the fact that the apples are generally presented as in the wrong for a lot of it just isn't that fun to watch. And obviously, you have Applejack coming off as pretty insensitive as well. So I feel like there's plenty of not fun stuff about this episode. And plus, I feel like some of the focus is a bit uneven. I mean, even aside from the issues with the message, I feel like in general, the pies are not as well developed as I would like. I feel like we could have done a bit more with seeing Pinkie's sisters and also her parents a bit. So I feel like those are things driving down the episode a little bit. But I still enjoy the episode. I mean, it is a Pinkie episode. It is sort of expanding on the storyline of the Pinkies, pies, and apples potentially being related. So that's something at least. But I can't have it too high, and it's here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we have a somewhat similar episode, but certainly one that's less flawed than the ones we already talked about. And here we have Canterlot Boutique. And the thing about this episode is the pacing. I feel like the pacing is sort of all over the place, where I feel like it's just bouncing around from different ideas, despite it having a pretty interesting story on the face of it, where Rarity is sort of taking the next step in her career of opening up a second shop, but obviously having to deal with the bigger aspects of her industry. The fact that she isn't just some small town boutique tailor anymore, that she is someone who is mass producing stuff now, and the fact that she has hired someone like Cassie Saddles, someone who is in the industry, someone who sees things through the lens of market research and mass production, while Rarity herself has to mass produce a bunch of stuff to the point where she loses interest, is definitely a strong message on its own and a pretty relatable one, and really something that I feel like could have propelled the episode. However, I feel like the pacing, again, it's just really fast paced, where I feel like a lot of it early on is dedicated to just introducing us to Rarity's new dress, but also to Sassy Saddles. And I feel like a lot of the burnout stage of the episode is sort of glazed over. And then we have a pretty prolonged ending where Rarity just gives up and decides to close the shop, only to see all the customers want to buy it before it's gone. And obviously, having Sassy sort of realize that she was a bit misguided. So I feel like to that end, the fact that the episode dedicates so much time to those at the beginning and the end, while sort of glazing over the more interesting part in the middle, is a bit of a problem at the end of the day, and something that really hampers my enjoyment of this episode. But it's still not a bad episode. I think it has some good ideas, and I feel like it's somewhat effective in executing them. I feel like at the end of the day, there are still issues with the pacing, issues with how it presents his ideas that cause me to not enjoy it as much as I probably should. And it's here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we're moving now to a grouping of episodes that I enjoy, but ones that have their issues and ones that are flawed. But at number 15, we have arguably the most flawed of the three, and here we have Party Pooped. And for me, the biggest issue with the episode is the yaks. I feel like the yaks are pretty unlikable in execution, where I guess I understand it in the sense that they are of a different culture, and they are like creatures that have different expectations for their ponies, and the fact that they are trying to branch out after being isolated for so long. But it's just that we see through a lot of the episode that, if I'm being perfectly honest, I mean, their culture kind of sucks. I mean, they are like perfectionists. Like, they expect these ponies to basically be perfect in recreating all of their traditions. And when they fail to do so, despite trying really hard to appease them, like, they get very upset. And we're expected to believe that Twilight's in the wrong for failing to like recreate all these traditions to a T. There's also the fact that they literally threatened to declare war on the ponies. What, for like not meeting their standards per se, which again, like, maybe the fact that this society has lasted as long as they have is pretty insane at the end of the day. I mean, that's not me trying to be insensitive. That's just how they come across in this episode. So I feel like the fact that they are presented as mostly two-dimensional people at the end of the day is not particularly great. And I feel like that's something that kind of hampers my enjoyment of the episode to a degree. However, I feel like the side plot is really what drives the episode, or the main plot, I guess, where Pinkie is trying to make things perfect, trying to go all the way out to Yak Yakistan in order to figure out what it is that makes them happy. And obviously we get that journey of hers where a lot of it is presented as kind of silly, but it's also somewhat entertaining seeing Pinkie go on this journey. How they talk about, how this mountain that she has to pass through, no one has ever survived that, but then Pinkie just survives it. The fact that she has a music career during this journey, like sort of a reference to the Beatles, is semi interesting. And just see her get all the way to Yak Yakistan only to for her to be pushed down the hill, and then her sled takes her all the way back home is pretty humorous, if I'm being perfectly honest. And even the stuff afterwards where her friends like find the party cave, they see and learn just how dedicated Pinkie is to her craft, of how it's not just about getting some decorations and throwing a party, it's about taking the time to know what everyone's likes and dislikes are, what everyone's tastes are, what everyone is and what makes them tick, which in turn allows her to optimize whatever she puts on to maximize their enjoyment. It's sort of like a science in a way. So I feel like that was a pretty interesting development. And just to see Pinkie's reaction when they finally see all this and come to appreciate all the work that she does to make them happy is pretty endearing at the end of the day. And of course, she is able to turn things around. So this is definitely an enjoyable episode, and I don't have too many complaints with the Pinkie storyline. It's just the Yak stuff is really not that great. And the fact that they are trying to present this other grouping of people as, like civilized and as one whose culture is worth respecting, the fact that they are seen as very intolerant and also very destructive, and it's only in later episodes that we really start to see like the more stronger aspects of their culture, is a big issue with the episode for me, and a big reason that it is down here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have a similar episode in this tier in that there is some good things about it and some not so great things. And I find this episode to be incredibly polarizing within the fandom, where I've heard people say that this is one of their favorite episodes in the entire show, while I've heard other people say that it's one of the worst episodes in the entire show. And I can definitely see the arguments for both, but obviously with its placement here, I'm sort of in the middle. But at number 14, we have Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep? And again, this episode is polarizing because it attempts to deal with a very serious subject matter, where we learn that Luna still feels incredibly guilty from what she did like 1,000 years ago, of trying to bring about eternal night and trying to basically destroy the world. And obviously, with that panning out here, we see her go so far as to torture herself by creating the Tantabus. And I'm a bit conflicted about how this is presented here, because on one hand, I feel like we definitely should have got more foreshadowing for this. I mean, when we saw like Luna come back in Luna Eclipse after like her first appearance since her redemption, I feel like that didn't give too much indication that she felt guilty about anything, that she was trying to return to normal per se. And obviously, with a lot of her episodes since then, don't really focus too much on this. And it feels like, to a degree, this does come out of nowhere. Like the fact that even after everything she's been through, she still feels guilty for what she did way back when. And the fact that she goes to such this extreme in order to make herself feel bad is not ideal for me. However, I also understand the perspective of people who see this as a legitimate like portrayal of mental health issues and self-destructive tendencies, so that I can't completely discredit this episode. I mean, I feel like it comes more so from the fact that other episodes didn't do more to set it up, that makes it feel a bit jarring in execution. So that's not particularly great. However, there are still some interesting aspects to this episode, like obviously the fact that we see other people's dreams, the fact that we see all these other characters use their dreams in order to fight off the Tantabus. Obviously, a very prominent moment is when Big Mac like turns into a star princess, which obviously is foreshadowing for another episode we'll be talking about soon on this list. And then obviously Scootaloo taking advantage of the fact that she's in a dream to grow enormous wings, wings that are way bigger than her body, in order to fly like a real Wonderbolt. And if you see my previous videos, you should probably know why I find that interesting. But there's another episode this season that also has a similar moment. So obviously that aspect to it is also pretty interesting. And again, I understand why people don't like this episode. They think that they completely botched the idea of mental health. Obviously, the idea that Luna would go so far as to create this thing that obviously escapes and threatens to torture other ponies and contributing to that guilt is obviously not the best thing. However, I don't completely oppose the execution of it. I don't think like it's the worst thing ever, which is a big reason why it's as high as it is. However, I can still acknowledge the issues with the setup to it and even some of the implications of her using this measure as a means of harming herself. So I kind of get it from that perspective. And those things are combined to make me have this episode in the middle of the list, and it's here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and again, we're sticking with this grouping of episodes, only this time we're talking about an episode that I have already talked about so much on this channel, and you probably know what it is. And at number 13, we have the season 5 finale, the Cutie Re-Mark. And again, I talked about this episode to death at this point. Literally, my 2-part ranking, my Starlight episode ranking, my redemption arc ranking at this point. Again, I have already laid out a lot of my thoughts on this episode, so I'll try not to go too far in detail this time. But basically, it boils down to the fact that I enjoy this episode while acknowledging its flaws. Again, the flaws are very apparent. Starlight's redemption arc is incredibly rushed in the episode. Her backstory doesn't have a lot of weight to it compared to what it could have been. And I feel like as a result, her redemption arc itself feels rushed and really feels like something that is more so Twilight's mission than the main six sort of realizing that she has changed. And it feels more like a marriage out of convenience in order to prevent Starlight from escaping and potentially using her strong magic in order to wreak more chaos. So again, I acknowledge those issues. However, I still feel like as a big Starlight fan, I do personally enjoy the moment of her sort of having her breakdown and her sort of coming to this realization. Again, with the context that this is still very rushed when you consider everything that has led up to it, but the actual moment itself is at least satisfying for me to watch. And again, I still personally respect a lot of the timelines that create a lot of the bad timelines, even though, again, it has the same pitfalls as most time travel stories, with, again, them picking and choosing which events are important to the timeline and picking and choosing the way in which the deviances ultimately create radically different timelines. So I still feel like that is an issue. But then again, that is an issue with all time travel stories as well. But I still admire a lot of the creativity with the different timelines, seeing all these various villains from previous seasons really highlighting what they could do to Equestria if they were to get into power. So again, there is plenty of merit to this episode, and I do personally enjoy watching this episode a lot. However, the flaws are very apparent. I've already talked about them to death, and this episode, it belongs in this tier. It is here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and we're sort of wrapping up this enjoyable but messy tier, and we have an episode that I have not talked about yet, and I know this might be controversial. I know people that love this episode consider it one of the very best. However, for me, again, it's sort of in the middle. But at number 12, we have Slice of Life. And it is about time that I got to weigh in on this episode. And again, I've heard a lot from both sides here, with, again, some people claiming that this is one of the best episodes ever. But also, I see the complaints about how this episode is chocked to the brim with fan service. And usually, when someone points out two sides on opposite ends of the spectrum, it's safe to assume that person is going to fall somewhere in the middle. As for me, I mean, that is the case. Because on one hand, yes, there is a lot of fan service, and they threw a lot on the wall. Some of it I liked, some of it I didn't really care for. I think one of the ones that didn't really work for me were the cultural references, like Doctor Who's and the Big Lebowski characters. I mean, I know Doctor Who's was popular in the fandom, but I personally never really cared for Doctor Who or like just his like science experiments and stuff. And the scenes he was in just didn't really do much for me. I mean, I'm sure some people will say that's mainly because I'd never watched Doctor Who or The Big Lebowski, and you're right. But what good is a cultural reference if people that don't get the reference can't get invested in what's happening? Also, and this seems like a random moment to bring up, I didn't like Gummy's monologue that much. I mean, I don't know. It's just not my sense of humor, and I don't know. It was just a random moment that didn't really click with me. But aside from that, I mean, this episode's still pretty good. I mean, I do like watching Derpy, like being a prime character and all this. I do enjoy a lot of the references. Again, not all of them. I really like the Lyra and Bonbon scene and them talking about how they're best friends. And I even like Celestia and Luna showing up, how they had their little argument at the wedding about Fred getting the gifts, and then ultimately them making up by the end. And at its core, I enjoy the episode's message that everyone is the hero of their own story, and that even if we don't see it, others do matter. I enjoy that aspect of it, and I feel like on the whole, this episode does a decent job of commemorating 100 episodes of the series. And there are moments from this episode that I do like. However, there's enough there that I either didn't like or stuff that just didn't click with me that makes me not see this episode in too high regard. And I do see the complaints about there being too much fan service, which, I mean, isn't the worst thing in the world. I mean, again, I feel like at this point, like you have to acknowledge the fact that the show has been shaped by the fandom and the fact that they did that by having all these characters in there. So I at least appreciate that, even if all the references and all the stuff didn't work for me, but it is at least good enough to land here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and from this point on the list, I feel like the rest of these episodes are pretty good, obviously to varying degrees, and I think that is part of the strength of season 5 because, yes, while it does have some very bad episodes, ones that I talked about earlier, I feel like at the end of the day, a lot of the episodes are either good or at least episodes that I enjoy watching, which includes a lot of those episodes at that middle tier of good but flawed. But at number 11, the episode that does the least for me, even though it's still pretty good, is Make New Friends but Keep Discord. And again, for a Discord episode, this is pretty good. I mean, while he isn't perfect from a morality standpoint, I mean, this is one of his more tolerable episodes. And I know I already talked about this one in my Discord episode ranking, but again, this is one of his better episodes. I mean, we see his relationship with Fluttershy, him getting jealous over her like hanging out more with Tree Hugger, and the fact that he is seen as a bit of a loser in the sense that Fluttershy is his only real friend, and him trying to prove to others that he does have other friends by being around Smooth, only for him to completely exclude Snooze and completely just use him as an instrument in order to get back with Fluttershy, but again, just failing at it. I mean, the climax is kind of weird where obviously he almost sends Tree Hugger to, I don't know, like a sock puppet dimension, only for Fluttershy to call him out. And admittedly, like him learning the lesson is a bit jarring, almost like a joke, like, oh yeah, that is a lesson I should learn. But again, it's still a pretty nice lesson for him to learn, and it's pretty good development for him in the sense that he needs to realize that Fluttershy has a life, and like obviously she can have other friends aside from him, and that he in turn can have other friends aside from her. And again, it leads to a pretty good outcome with him treating Smooth better, while him respecting Fluttershy's boundaries to a degree. So again, it's a good episode, but not one that I would call one of my favorites, one that doesn't resonate with me as much, even though I feel like on the whole it is pretty solid, and it's here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and I can see some people thinking this episode is a bit too high, and to be fair, I mean, the presentation of this episode isn't spectacular, but it is a message that I do connect a lot with, and here we have Made in Manhattan. And this episode's pretty good. I mean, I know there's a lot of similarities to Rainbow Road Trip in that much of the story is about community and bringing back old traditions. And that is definitely a theme that, again, resonates with me. It makes me think about traditions my town used to have when I was little, but just over time, people moving away, becoming less involved, just cause a lot of those traditions to become either non existent or a shell of their former selves. And I like how this episode deals with it too, where we see a lot of the townspeople remember the festival fondly and would like it if it came back, but they're just simply too busy or they don't want to put in the work to bring it back. And while the episode doesn't shy away from that reality, it also teaches that you don't need to make a grand spectacle to make something happen. That grand spectacle stemmed from the fact that Charity was so involved in the process that it couldn't survive without her. So, to that end, there is encouragement for those that only have a little to give. Then obviously that little thing matters. And aside from that, you also have Applejack's story of wondering why she was summoned to Manhattan in the first place. And we see her struggle to adapt to the city, which again kind of sheds new light on her experience moving there as a filly. So there's quite a bit going on for this episode. But with that said, I'm not in love with this episode either, where despite resonating with the themes, I feel like, again, the episode left some stuff on the table. I mean, people say this episode has no stakes and that there isn't any urgency for this community to come together again. And while these people aren't wrong, I don't think that inherently isn't the problem. I mean, this episode didn't need a villain or some threat for not pulling this thing off. I mean, I think the biggest thing that could have elevated this episode instead is simply more screen time for Coco. I feel like because the episode focuses a lot on Applejack and her just wondering what her contribution is, we don't get enough of Coco's desire to bring this cherished tradition back to life. Like, maybe if he spends some more time, like her reflecting on what the tradition means to her and what bringing it back would bring. Like, obviously, in a city as big and detached and impersonal as Manhattan, obviously bringing it back would mean a lot to her. So I feel like the episode would have been a bit better if they focused more on Coco rather than just Applejack. But at the end of the day, it is still a solid episode and one that deserves to be this high on the list. But obviously, there are episodes that I feel like do a better job at executing upon its themes. So because of that, it is here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9. And this is an episode that I sort of considered as similar to Do Princess Dream of Magic Sheep in the sense that, you know, like some people may find its handling of its subject matter a bit controversial, and I did consider putting it in that similar tier as that episode. However, after thinking about some more, I don't have as many problems with its execution, and especially compared to the last time I discussed this episode. But at number 9, we have Brotherhooves Social. And it's sort of fitting how it's back to back on this list with Made in Manhattan, with obviously this episode taking place at the same time as that other episode. And again, people point to the fact that Big Mac cross dresses in this episode and how that element isn't handled the best. And to be fair, I mean, there are definitely a couple moments where it doesn't quite work. I mean, particularly during the song. I mean, that's not particularly great. However, for the most part, I think it is handled all right, with obviously a lot of the humor coming from Big Mac thinking that he is trying to fool all these ponies into thinking that he's a woman so that he'll pass off as Apple Bloom's sister. But then obviously it's revealed later on that they knew all along that he was a male, like cross dressing, but it's more so the fact that he was very disruptive during and was so determined to win at any cost that causes them to get disqualified. So I feel like the episode did cover its bases somewhat based on that. But obviously, the big highlight of the episode, the one that even people that don't like this episode will acknowledge, is the ending, where obviously Big Mac is able to open up, is able to talk about how he feels overshadowed by Applejack, especially after Applejack has saved Equestria a number of times at this point, to the point where he feels like Apple Bloom looks up to her more than to him. And again, it is a pretty solid moment, and actually one that connects back to Slice of Life in the sense that obviously everyone is the hero of their own story. And we see in this episode, this is very much a case where Big Mac is the hero of his story, and he is trying to sort of step out of the narrative that we are accustomed to, where Applejack is the hero and everyone else is sort of in the background. And again, I admire that effort, and I admire that effort a lot. And it is a pretty touching scene, and a big reason I have this one above Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep, in that obviously it has that big pro. And even like the subject matter, like while I get the complaints, I personally don't have as many issues with it, but it is still enough of a problem to where I do have to leave this episode here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8. And again, I can also see people thinking this one is too high as well, especially this one over Made in Manhattan. But this is again an episode that I like a lot personally. And here we have Scaremaster. And again, I talked about this one previously on my holiday episode ranking. But if you ask me, I mean, it's one that I connect with a lot because, again, I am not a big Halloween fan. I feel like it is a holiday that just doesn't gel well with me. But yet, every year, like when that time of year comes, I feel some level of pressure to engage in it, even though it's not really my jam. I mean, I don't like horror movies. I don't like seeing like stuff where people die or get haunted or have their lives turned upside down. Again, I'm a very normie person in that regard. So to see an episode like this where we have Fluttershy, someone who, like me, does not like Halloween, albeit for slightly different reasons, and her like honestly giving the holiday a try, trying to connect with it, trying to use it as a way to spend time with her friends, but then ultimately walking away from it, not liking it, and really affirming to herself that she doesn't need to force herself to participate in this holiday, even though it is something that her friends enjoy. Again, I can see some people not liking that message very much, how they'll say, oh, friendship is all about compromise, or it's not about what you do, it's about who you spend the time with. And I agree with that message. However, again, the episode balances it very well, where it's able to say that Fluttershy doesn't like Halloween and recognizes it. She tried it out. She tried to get into her friends' heads and see what it is that they enjoy about this holiday. And while she eventually gets it, she comes to the realization that she doesn't like need to do it for herself, that there will always be other times for her friends to connect, but this is just not one of those times. And that is a pretty unique message, and it's a pretty powerful one as well. I mean, it's a reminder that we, yes, while we may do stuff that we don't always like for the sake of others, that on the other hand of that, like we can't force people to do stuff that they don't like just because we like it and we think that it'll be good for them. That sometimes people just know what's best for them, and that while this that not everything may be for them, that there'll be other opportunities for them to connect as well. And again, that is a powerful message to convey, a pretty unique message to convey as well, where I feel like most episodes would end with Fluttershy like scaring her friends, them saying that's the whole spirit, and then her just falling head over heels over it. This episode is able to strike a very nice balance for me. And considering, again, I am someone that personally doesn't like Halloween that much, and obviously someone that sides more with Fluttershy, then I walk away from that feeling like it is something that's unique and something that speaks to me. So again, I still feel like this is a pretty solid episode and one that deserves to be here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7. And again, we're sticking with pretty solid episodes here. At here at number 7, we do have Castle Sweet Castle. And this is a pretty good character piece for me, where obviously a lot of it focuses on Twilight and her getting this big castle that feels very big and impersonal, and obviously not feeling like it's home to her. Again, I feel like this is very much an episode that falls in line with the way that I write fan fiction, or at least the way that I used to write fan fiction back in those days, where I'll just take a small element from a previous episode and just blow it up. And obviously, we get that here, where we obviously have the destruction of Twilight's old home in Twilight's kingdom. And while that is a pretty brief moment in that episode, largely due to the circumstances under which it happens, it's refreshing to see an entire episode not too long afterwards dedicate time to assessing the damage and really considering the ramifications of that decision or that outcome per se. And again, it's really nice seeing Twilight slowly come to terms with the fact that she's lost her home and that her new home isn't instantly a nice replacement, despite it technically being a superior option. It's bigger, it's more grand per se, it's more out of the town and less crowded. So there's that to consider. Then obviously there's her friends like trying to help her make this castle a home, which is a very solid song. I do like that song a lot. Although one could question the message a bit, or at least the fact that the characters don't instantly recognize that, oh, hey, what makes this a home for me isn't necessarily what's going to make a home for Twilight. And, you know, you couldn't quibble a bit with whether that's a message that the characters need to learn. I mean, personally, I definitely err on the side of it not being one entirely. I mean, or at least not in the sense that obviously they literally try to emulate whatever style they prefer, and the fact that they don't really communicate much until they really have done their damage is a bit silly for me. But again, I feel like at its core, this episode is pretty strong. I mean, obviously, a lot of it does center on Twilight, her spending time on the town with Spike, and then obviously that scene where they do see the wreckage of their old home and having that moment to really reflect on it. And then obviously the rest of the main six eventually coming around to taking that wreckage and putting it into the home so that it'll feel more personal to Twilight. Obviously, that's a pretty touching moment as well. So again, there's plenty of pros for this episode. Again, I mean, obviously all the stuff with Twilight, the song is pretty good, and even the characters coming around towards the end to really make it a home for Twilight is pretty strong. However, it's just the minor nitpicks of the rest of the main six not communicating as much, and them like somehow being under the impression that their specific vision is what's needed to be done. That leads this episode to be here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty solid episode as well. Granted, one that I don't enjoy rewatching as much as, say, Castle Sweet Castle, but again, is very solid. And here we have Bloom and Gloom. Again, I know I already talked about this one, so I'll keep it brief. Again, I feel like this episode does a decent job at highlighting a lot of Appaloosa's fears, and really the rest of the CMC's fears, that not only will they not get a Cutie Mark that they don't want, but that'll lead to a pretty miserable life. And yes, this is part of the trilogy of the CMC getting helped out by Luna in the last one, of course. So you know that's coming. And again, I feel like this one is definitely pretty impactful and one that connects pretty well to the theme of the CMC figuring out what their purpose is. Obviously, the dream sequences are all pretty interesting, with Appaloon getting like a buzz fly thing, and obviously that not working out well for her. Her getting a not Apple related Cutie Mark and then getting rejected from her family as a result. And even like the other CMC streams as well, like you literally have like Scootaloo figuring out that she is in a dream and immediately starts flying, which again speaks a lot to Scootaloo's character. And again, this episode also has Applejack and her in the real world, like really reassuring Apple Bloom. She sings a nice little song. Again, at its core, it's a very, very solid episode. Not my personal favorite by any means, but one that I honestly can't complain too much about, but it is here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and again, we have another very solid episode for me, and here we have The Lost Treasure of Griffinstone, aka Gilda's redemption arc. And again, this is a very solid episode. You have Pinkie and Rainbow going to Griffinstone, obviously with their connection to Gilda back in Griffin the Brush Off, and obviously Rainbow not really liking Gilda after what happened in that episode. And a lot of this involves Rainbow and Gilda like not really seeing eye to eye, even though Pinkie, technically the person who Gilda has wronged more, is more forgiving of Gilda and is trying to get her to open up a bit. Obviously, we have the entire story that Grandpa Gruff shares of the treasure getting lost, and then Pinkie's reaction at the end where she's crying and she's like, "That's the saddest story ever." We have that. We obviously have the adventure of them trying to get it, like specifically Rainbow trying to get it by herself, only to get into danger, and it's up to Gilda and Pinkie to rescue them. We have a very brief flashback to Gilda and Rainbow becoming friends as like children, and obviously that's a very touching scene, really seeing how Gilda was someone who was very lonely, saw Rainbow as her only friend, and someone who really helped her out, which definitely provides some context over why she's so defensive of Rainbow, and partially why her losing Rainbow might have been very bad for her, in the sense that sort of made her a bit bitter in retrospect. There's obviously the scene where she sort of learns to make friends, in that she extends out her cooking to another Griffin, and that sort of coming together. There's that. There's the promise that Gilda will be able to spread friendship through Griffinstone, which again has some stuff down the road, particularly with Gabby, like seeing this experience and coming back in a later episode. And then later with Gallus. So that's at least something that this episode provides, in that it leads to all these ripple effects down the road. Plus, it is a pretty solid episode in its own right, which makes me put it this high on the list. However, I feel like the top 4 definitely do more for me, definitely feel like more complete packages, which is a big reason that I had to leave this episode here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and interestingly, 3 of these top 4 are episodes I already talked about in a previous video, so I'll try not to get into too much detail with those episodes, but they are still worthy of mention. But at number 4, we do have the season 5 premiere, the Cutie Map. And again, this is a very solid 2-parter, very solid story of them figuring out what the Cutie Map is, being summoned to our town, and then eventually meeting Starlight for the first time. It's very interesting seeing Starlight in this episode coming off as very nice, but also someone that is very calculated and someone who clearly has something up her sleeve. And then obviously we see throughout a lot of the episode the main 6 trying to figure things out, slowly able to learn more about the rest of the town ponies there, them having their cutie marks removed and spending a lot of part 2 in the detention center trying to get brainwashed by her. Obviously, we have Fluttershy's entire scheme of figuring out Starlight's secret that she still has her cutie mark, and then her getting outed for still having her cutie mark, which, again, I've already talked about previously. I'm not a huge fan of the whole hypocrisy route, especially learning in the Cutie Re-Mark that Starlight genuinely has disdain with cutie marks, although I do have issues with the backstory. It is a genuine trauma for her to consider. However, the fact that she has to resort to hypocrisy in order to accomplish her goals, like, sort of questions that to a certain extent. But again, it's not ideal. The way that she handles that situation doesn't help matters either. Maybe she should have been a bit more apologetic in terms of her having to use her cutie mark in order to take away cutie marks, with the promise that she would take her own after everyone else is taken, only for that to not work. But obviously it goes for the more defensive, power hungry approach that, again, isn't ideal. Obviously, there's the whole chase scene at the end, and then obviously Starlight escapes with the setup that she'll eventually return later on, so that's something at least. And in general, the idea that Starlight is this normal pony in comparison to some of the previous antagonists that we've had, with them being like these creatures. Again, the idea that just a normal pony can you weaponize friendship or a notion of friendship in order to gain power is pretty interesting in its own right, even if there are some slight issues with execution. But on the whole, this is a very complete package for me, a very solid 2-parter for me. But I feel like the top 3 episodes have more to offer, and because of that, it is here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and I did consider moving this episode down a bit. However, the more I thought about it, the more I just really enjoyed it. But here at number 3, we do have the main attraction. And it's sort of crazy that I talked about this one in a previous video. I actually don't remember my musical episode video that well, so it's sort of crazy that I already discussed it. But again, I did consider putting it a bit lower, as at the end of the day, it is a relatively simple story where, again, like, you have Coloratura coming on there, being this big famous pony that wants to express herself more freely, but is being held down by her manager, Sven Gallop. And then Sven Gallop is your stereotypical, conceited, arrogant producer that mistreats Pinkie a lot, is trying to use Coloratura's clout in order to get his own personal gain, which isn't great. And again, it's relatively simple. I do appreciate the fact that Rara at her core is still a nice pony, and it's more so Sven Gallop taking advantage of her, and ultimately soiling her image in the eyes of Applejack. The Applejack is essentially forced to see through it, and is basically forcing Rara to actively make a decision. And I do find it very creative how they're able to out Sven Gallop by recording one of his outbursts at Pinkie, which is interesting. And then obviously we get to the song towards the end, which, again, I have criticized to a degree. I mean, it's weird because I think the visuals are, I don't know, a bit generic for me, in the sense that you have the orchestra in the background, which is a bit cheesy. And then even more cheesy is all the unicorns lighting up their horns like they're cell phone lighters. So I don't know, I found that a bit cheesy, but the main reason I have this episode this high is because I love it despite all those things in its favor. I mean, there isn't anything too wrong with it. I mean, yes, it does get a bit cheesy at points, and at the end of the day, it is a relatively simple story. But this episode is really carried on the back of its star power. Like, Lena Hall is a very interesting guest star, especially if you know her story from her referencing the show after winning her Tony. So I found that pretty interesting. And again, the song, yes, while verging a bit too close into Let It Go territory, is still a very solid song. The song she sings both at the very beginning and the end of the episode is still very good as well. And I do enjoy Applejack's relationship with Rara and her trying to express her, I guess, altruism despite having a terrible manager. So that's at least an interesting dynamic. And the real reason why this episode is high is because of its spectacle. But even some of the more substantive stuff beneath the surface is pretty solid. So with all that said, I did decide to have the episode this high, namely because of my enjoyment of it. Although I can see the debate for this episode being a bit lower. But for this list, at least, I decided to have it here at number 3. All right, now we're at number 2. And I will say up front that even though a lot of the episodes we've already been talking about are pretty solid for various reasons, to me, there is a pretty clear gap between the main attraction and these top 2 episodes. These top 2 episodes are something else, in my personal opinion. And you may not necessarily agree with it. I mean, at the end of the day, it is my list, but you are free to disagree. But I feel like these top 2 episodes are essentially in a league of their own, in my personal opinion. And it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 2, we have Crusaders of the Lost Mark. And again, this episode kind of goes without saying. Now, I know there are people that criticize this episode because of Diamond Tiara's redemption arc. There are issues with that. But I already talked about in my redemption arc video how I find Diamond Tiara's redemption arc to be very compelling to me. How I don't really fault her as much in the sense that she is a child and someone who is very susceptible to being influenced by her environment. And obviously that comes to a head in this episode. But I think the bigger strength, even more so, is the fact that Diamond Tiara is the most central figure to the CMC's journey of getting their Cutie Marks. I mean, they did come together when they were having Diamond Tiara's quinceanera at a point in her life where she assumed that by having her Cutie Mark, she had everything figured out and that she was in a position to talk down to the CMC for not having their Cutie Marks. However, we see this come full circle now where Diamond Tiara recognizes that maybe she didn't know her Cutie Mark as well. And with the entire purpose of Cutie Marks being to know what your life purpose is based on them, the fact that she isn't sure what it is anymore is very interesting. And the fact that the CMC essentially help her find her Cutie Mark, almost like getting it herself, is a very interesting way of them to eventually get their own Cutie Marks. And obviously, things do come full circle in this episode in that regard. So I feel like this is a very pivotal episode, and the fact that it is centered around Diamond Tiara getting her redemption arc is very interesting to me. Now again, you could nitpick the fact that there isn't as much setup here, and while that is technically a problem, I feel like at the end of the day, it is still very central to the story here, and again, it is able to execute it very well. I mean, also the fact that within the episode, Diamond Tiara isn't instantly good. Like, yes, while we learn in this episode that she wishes she could be somebody else and that she is a product of her environment, she still has some difficulty in actually making a change, where we do see her start to give in a bit, but when the opportunity presents itself to her for her to go back to her old ways, she does rush towards that, thinking that it'll please her mom. And obviously, she does eventually make the right decision. But the fact that we see her sort of go back and forth, her essentially having a battle with herself between like doing what she wants deep down and satisfying the status quo, which is more comfortable, something that she's more familiar with, even if it's something that doesn't make her happy, is still very compelling to watch. And then obviously the CMC getting their Cutie Marks, again, having all this come full circle in a very satisfying way. Another thing I'll mention, and I know I already talked about this when I talked about this episode in the past, is the fact that, again, not related to the episode itself, but more so the fact that they essentially hid the fact that this was a major episode. The fact that when we first got the episode description way back when, we were told that it was mainly going to be about the CMC helping Pipsqueak run for president. And obviously, the first time I watched this episode, I remember when the election was wrapped up after the first 5 minutes that, oh, wait, we've been duped. There is more going on here. And obviously, we get that in great benefits as well. So there's that. And I will say that the music in this episode is very strong. I mean, obviously, it is a musical episode, but each of the songs really have a lot to deliver. Where you obviously had Diamond Tiara's song, like saying that she wishes she could be somebody else. The reprise is pretty good as well. The election song is also pretty good, although admittedly the weakest song in my personal opinion, but still pretty good. There's the song that they're singing as Diamond Tiara's racing towards the school. Again, it has a lot of great moments within that. And then my favorite song of all is actually We'll Make Our Mark, which they sing at the beginning in the lead up to the rest of the episode. But then obviously at the end, after they do get their Cutie Marks. So I think the music here is another thing that's very much carrying this episode. Again, it is a very, very strong soundtrack that makes this episode extremely enjoyable to watch. So again, there are some slight issues with this episode, but I think what really catapults it is, one, the fact that it does tie into a lot of the major themes of the show, and the fact that it is able to come full circle in a very roundabout way, but also the presentation where, again, it does convey all these ideas through a musical, and the songs are all very strong and very effective at communicating the characterization and the story developments that happen. So those are all things that are really, really propelling this episode up, and a big reason why this is actually one of my favorite episodes in the entire series. Again, I know some people will disagree, but it is still one of my favorites. However, there is one episode I think is even better than it, and we'll get into that right now.
And now, at number 1, the best episode of season 5 is one that I have not talked about on this channel yet, but I'm doing it right now. But here we have Amending Fences. And it's sort of crazy that this episode ended up being number 1, especially when you consider the fact that I had 2 big episodes not too long before it, with obviously 2 musical episodes and then a 2-parter here. So obviously I have something like this, which is a normal 22-minute episode and one that doesn't have any songs in it. Mind you, it didn't really have much of a space for songs, but whatever. But basically, I love this episode a lot. And I guess to explain why is to basically involve me explaining the entire story. So, I mean, first of all, the concept is pretty amazing if you ask me, to where it honestly feels like the type of thing that I would write a fanfic about. Now, I know that me saying that doesn't sound like a compliment too much, but it's the type of story that, like, you don't immediately think of when you think of stories to tell, where you basically take a small moment from a very early episode and just completely blow it up into this down-to-earth and serious story. But they managed to do it, and they managed to execute it upon it pretty well. I mean, Twilight obviously goes back to Canterlot to reunite with her friends. And one thing that I really enjoy about this episode is the tone, where it does manage to have this fairly rooted tone in it, between Twilight, like spending time in her old quarters and seeing how decrepit's become, to her interacting with each of their friends. I mean, when we see the way that she talks to, like, Minuet and Lemonheart, and really get a sense that these characters have a history together, this episode does a great job at building a sense of nostalgia and wistfulness that comes with the past. And obviously that's built into the episode, given how the episode is all about these characters exploring their past, but also sort of reflecting upon the show's history as well. I mean, with obviously references to the very early episodes as well. So I feel like it ties into it very well. And in turn, it makes the whole viewing experience very interesting compared to the rest of the series. We obviously have Moondancer, and Moondancer is very compelling as a character, not only because she is meant to be this antithesis to Twilight. I mean, people talk about Moondancer a lot as, oh, what if she would be what Twilight would be if she had never moved to Ponyville. But I think it goes a little deeper than that, where obviously we saw Twilight get on the path that she does I mean, in large part due to her role in the Sonic Brain Boom, where through her being a part of that and unleashing her magic, Celestia took her on as a student, and then with her becoming tied to the elements of harmony, that allowed her to be sent to Ponyville, to be a part of this prophecy, basically, to save Equestria, but also to be set on a path to make friends and to learn all these values that come with friendship. So Twilight was very much set in a privileged position due to destiny here. But then we have Moondancer, who is this pony who, for all intents and purposes, is the same as Twilight, having similar issues, but not being touched by that same level of destiny. And so that she didn't get the same resources that she needed. She didn't have Celestia by her side, making sure that she was doing what she needed to do to save Equestria, or like maybe rule Equestria one day. And then through that, she basically didn't have the support system that she needed in order to learn friendship or become something other than this shut-in. So I find that dynamic to be pretty interesting. But at the same time, the episode makes it very clear that Moondancer looks up to Twilight even from a young age, where she obviously even styled her mane like Twilight, believe it or not. And obviously we have her like playing the party as part of her coming out, only for Twilight to not show up because she had a lot of studying to catch up on. And I know some people complain about this, saying how Moondancer had other people in her life, other people that came to the party and other people that would have been friends with her, like people like Minuet, and therefore her response was a bit exaggerated. And I kind of get it, but the episode does establish that Moondancer was someone who cared about Twilight more than anything else. And then when she was rejected by Twilight, someone that she saw as her equal, someone that she wanted to get the approval of, that was what really struck her down. And considering that she already struggled with socializing and she really needed someone that could talk about the same interests as her, someone that could relate to her on a similar level, she knew that she couldn't get that with the others. I mean, even though they cared. And obviously the other aspect to it is that on the flip side, we see like Minuet and Lemon Hearts, like, yes, they are nice to the others and they definitely want to reach out and care, but the episode also makes it pretty clear that they are living their own lives and how they understand if like others don't want to like get their help and stuff. I mean, we saw them like understand that Twilight was a bad friend and that they never expected her to do anything. And then when they stopped asking Moondancer to come out, it wasn't out of malice or anything. It was because they figured that Moondancer was doing what she wanted, and which was to not spend time with anyone, and therefore they just like moved on. And I know some people may take that to be them not being likable, but I feel like it's pretty realistic, all things considered. And that's another element of this episode that is really interesting, like the whole dynamic of these former friends of Twilight and Moondancer, the way that they interact, to where the episode does strike a very interesting balance between them like being normal people who like just want to live their lives and they don't want to interfere too much into like stuff that like they feel like they aren't really involved in per se, but also like being very caring when people do speak up and when people do say that they want to be involved. So I feel like that balance is also very interesting. And then of course we get to the rest of the story where Twilight tries to like help out Moondancer, try to apologize to her, and then Moondancer just shutting her out at every opportunity. We get some funny stuff in the library there. We had that whole scene when Twilight is able to lure Moondancer to her quarters, and they have that whole conversation like where they sort of rekindle the relationship and they start to realize that they are on the same page again. And it seems like that Moondancer is making progress. But then deep down, she still very much wants to just get back to her studying. And now that is the main reason why she is having this conversation, as opposed to her realizing that her life has kind of gone off track per se. And then obviously we have the dinner scene, which again ties into that dynamic of the rest of the friends, like again, wanting to be nice and wanting to be caring, but obviously not always being super well equipped to do so. So I found that pretty interesting. And all that leads up to the party do-over, which has Pinkie in it, which is interesting. There's some fun jabs there of Pinkie pointing out how Twilight is supposed to be the princess of friendship when she doesn't know everything about her friends. So there's that. And then we get to what's probably one of the most iconic scenes in the entire show when Moon Dancer shows up to the party and she lets Twilight have it by giving her whole speech about how she felt like she wasn't important and how that party meant everything to her, and then she breaks down, and the way in which Moon Dancer just slowly builds up until she's yelling at Twilight and just really cutting into it is just a really powerful scene. And I remember the first time I watched it, like, I wasn't entirely sure what to make of it, and honestly, like, a part of me felt that it was a bit much at the time. But I think over time, just as I started thinking more and more about what made this episode tick, like the fact that this episode is able to have this grounded, like, tone to it in which the characters do act in a semi-realistic way, I figured that it did make sense at the end of the day. And I feel like at the end that it really does articulate why that party, but also Twilight's involvement in it, really meant everything to Moon Dancer. Moon Dancer does look at the Twilight and really saw Twilight's approval of her as the ultimate source of her self-worth, and when that wasn't validated, and that caused her to retreat, and that caused her to retreat to her studies, to her comfort zone, so that she would never have to experience the hurt of putting herself out there again for the approval of people that she cares about. And it's through the scene where Twilight owns up to her mistake, where she admits that she can't undo the pain that she caused, but that shouldn't be the reason that she can't be friends with anyone else. And that's immediately made explicit when we hear that there are other options out there, that just because other ponies can't exactly relate to her and don't always have the same interests as her, that doesn't mean that they don't care about her and that they can't be her friends. I mean, yes, we did see them not be outgoing earlier on, but that was because they didn't realize that deep down that Moon Dancer is unhappy with the circumstances of her life, that her retreating back to studying seemed to be coming from a source of happiness and just being content with her life. And it was only afterwards that they came to realize that she wanted friends and that she saw that party as everything, and that it really took a toll on her self-worth. So I find that whole dynamic very interesting. And then obviously we get the ending in which Spike gives Moon Dancer the gift that he wanted to give her way back when. And it's that picture of the friends hanging out from before Twilight left. And that picture really sums up all the dynamics I just described there. I mean, if you just look at it, you can see that Twilight doesn't care about her friends, that Moon Dancer is looking up to her, that the others are just going about their lives as normal, and they aren't in the business of interfering with what their friends are doing. So I feel like that is another great summation for the episode. So I guess the best way to bring this all together is that this episode is a very deep and complete package, if you ask me, where it does seem to feel like a different episode of the show with its grounded tone and its ability to still be somewhat lighthearted at points. It really exudes this feeling of nostalgia when you see these friends hanging out and really feeling the history that they have for each other. That reminds me of my own history, and it tends to make me feel nostalgic for earlier times in my life when I think about people that I went to school with or that I have since lost touch with. It really captures that feeling very well. And to see their interactions upon reuniting is very interesting in its own right. And also, I feel like this episode does a very good and covert job at tying into the show's themes, and particularly season 5 themes of tying into Cutie Marks, where, as I alluded to earlier, Twilight and Moon Dancer are pretty good foils of the theme of Cutie Marks, how Twilight is essentially the one who got destined to save Equestria and got sent on this path thanks to her relationship with Celestia and Celestia's commitment to ensuring that she got the one-on-one instruction and support that she needed to learn the lessons of friendship and to really fully realize her potential there. while Moondancer did not get that support, and as a result, she had a much tougher time with expressing what she wanted, of communicating her problems, and ultimately getting the friendship that would give her the fulfillment in life. So I feel like that is another strong aspect of the episode. And in general, this episode is just very satisfying to watch. I mean, while it doesn't have the musical numbers that I mentioned at the beginning, I mean, it does still have pretty good atmosphere to it between those scenes of the characters talking and even the background music. I mean, I haven't even talked about that yet, but I feel like this episode definitely has the best background music in the entire series, especially at the end when Spike is giving that present to Moondancer and we hear that accordion play. Like, that is a very impactful piece of music right there. So even then, like, the episode does a great job in making you feel like this is a special experience that you're watching, even though it's technically a normal 22-minute episode. So I know that I've been going on a while now about this episode, but I really needed to hammer it home why this episode in particular is number one, better than Crusaders of the Lost Mark, and better than the Cutie Map, and better than the main attraction. And I know there's people who think this episode's overrated, or they just see it as a normal episode, but for me at least, I feel like there's a lot going on here, and I personally get a lot of enjoyment when watching it. And I feel like there's a lot of like gems that come with interpreting it. So I feel like this episode, above all else, really stands out among the pack. And it's for those reasons I have it here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And like I said, moving forward, I will be continuing with this series. Again, next up, we have the season 6 of ranking to do, so stay tuned for that. We have other videos coming up for other shows that I like moving forward, so stay tuned for that as well. But for now, that is the video. See ya.